I'm coming home, she said quickly, before Elijah could speak. Good, he replied, his voice cold but steady. We need to talk when you get here. Don't keep me waiting. The call ended abruptly, leaving Miriam trembling. She turned back to Nathaniel, her voice breaking as she spoke. I have to go. Nathaniel nodded, his expression somber. Goodbye, Miriam. I'll be gone by morning. She hesitated for a moment, then leaned in, pressing a lingering kiss to his cheek. Goodbye, Nathaniel. Back at the parsonage, Elijah was sitting in the living room, his Bible open on his lap. He looked up when Miriam walked in, his expression unreadable. She felt the weight of his disappointment as she sat across from him. I spoke to Nathaniel, she began, her voice trembling. He's leaving tonight. Elijah nodded slowly. That's a start. But it doesn't fix what's broken here, Miriam. I know, she said, tears filling her eyes. I know I've hurt you, Elijah. I've betrayed you, and I've betrayed our vows. But I want to fix this. I want to be the wife you deserve. Elijah studied her for a long moment, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. I've been praying about this all night, he said finally. Part of me wants to throw you out, to tell the congregation everything and let them judge you. But another part of me, the part that still loves you, wants to find a way to move forward. Miriam's tears spilled over, and she reached for his hand. I'll do whatever it takes, Elijah. I'll step down from the worship team. I'll go to counseling. I'll do anything to earn back your trust. He pulled his hand away, shaking his head. This isn't just about you, Miriam. I've been so focused on the church that I've neglected you. I let you feel invisible, and for that, I'm sorry. But this is going to take time. A lot of time. She nodded, her heart heavy with both guilt and relief. I understand. Elijah stood, closing his Bible. We'll start with honesty, Miriam. Total honesty, from this moment forward. No more secrets. Across town, Nathaniel sat in his car, watching the lights of Harmony Chapel fade into the distance. His departure was meant to bring closure, but as he drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that this chapter wasn't truly over. Back at the church, Sister Beatrice watched from the shadows as Miriam and Elijah left the parsonage together the next morning. Her lips pursed in disapproval. To her, forgiveness was a luxury the pastor couldn't afford. This isn't over, she murmured to herself, clutching her Bible tightly. Not while the truth still has a chance to shine. Sister Beatrice's resolve deepened as she walked away from the parsonage that morning. She had seen too much in her years at Harmony Chapel to believe this would simply fade away. The congregation deserved the truth, even if Pastor Elijah was too proud or too blind to reveal it himself. She began her campaign quietly, planting subtle questions during the women's prayer meeting later that day. We must always pray for strength in our leadership, she said, her tone heavy with meaning. Even the strongest among us can falter when temptation whispers. Her words rippled through the group like a stone tossed into still water. By the time the meeting ended, several women were already speculating about what, or who, Beatrice might be referring to. At the parsonage, Elijah and Miriam began their delicate dance toward reconciliation. They avoided discussing Nathaniel directly, but his presence lingered in the air like a ghost neither could exorcise. Elijah spent more time at home, cutting back on his late nights at the church office. Miriam tried to show her repentance through action, taking on extra duties around the house and preparing Elijah's favorite meals. But the unspoken tension between them grew with each passing day. One evening, as they sat in silence at the dinner table, Elijah finally broke the quiet. Miriam, he said, his voice firm but not unkind, we need to talk about counseling. She looked up, her fork paused midair. I told you I'm willing, Elijah. Whatever it takes. There's a couples retreat coming up next month, he continued. It's out of town, away from the congregation. I think it could help us rebuild. Miriam nodded slowly. I'll go. Thank you for giving me this chance. Elijah's eyes softened, but the lines of worry on his face didn't fade. It's not just about the retreat, Miriam. I need to see that you're truly committed. That you're ready to let go of him. Her chest tightened at the mention of Nathaniel, even indirectly. I am, Elijah, she said quickly. I'll do whatever it takes to prove it. Meanwhile, Nathaniel found himself in a new town, performing at another church. But the energy wasn't the same. The songs felt hollow, and his heart wasn't in it. He thought of Miriam constantly, despite his prayers to let her go. One night, as he was packing up after a service, he found a small envelope tucked into his guitar case. He opened it to find a letter written in familiar, looping handwriting. Nathaniel. I shouldn't be writing this, but I can't stop thinking about you. I don't know how to let you go. Please don't reply, this has to be the last time. But I needed you to know how much you've meant to me. It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. Nathaniel's heart ached as he read the words. He knew responding would only deepen the wounds they had already caused, but the temptation was strong. Back at Harmony Chapel, the whisper Sister Beatrice had carefully cultivated began to reach critical mass. Deacon Harold, always one to keep a finger on the pulse of the congregation, approached Elijah after service one Sunday. Pastor, may I have a word? Harold asked, his voice low. Elijah gestured for him to sit. Of course, Harold. What's on your mind? The deacon hesitated, then leaned in closer. There's been talk about Miriam. About her and that singer, Nathaniel. I didn't want to believe it, but people are starting to ask questions. Elijah's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. Thank you for bringing this to me, Harold. I'll address it. But as the deacon left, Elijah felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him harder than ever. The time for quiet resolutions was over. That evening, Elijah gathered Miriam in the living room. The congregation knows something, he said bluntly. Her face paled. What do you mean? Who's been talking? Sister Beatrice, for one, he replied. And others are starting to listen. We can't keep this under wraps anymore, Miriam. If we do, it will destroy not just us but the entire church. What do you want me to do? She asked, her voice trembling. Elijah sighed deeply. We are going to address it. Together. I'll call a meeting with the church elders. We'll be honest, but we'll also ask for their understanding and forgiveness. This doesn't have to be the end, Miriam, but we can't hide anymore. Meanwhile, Sister Beatrice caught wind of the planned meeting and saw her moment to strike. She began gathering a small group of like-minded congregants, ready to press for Miriam's removal and potentially Elijah's resignation. This church needs leadership we can trust, she told them. If the pastor can't keep his own house in order, how can he shepherd the rest of us? The tension in Harmony Chapel was palpable as the elders' meeting approached. Miriam felt like a woman standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure whether she'd be pushed over or find a way to step back. And Nathaniel, miles away, stared at the unsigned letter on his nightstand, wondering if it was truly over, or if their paths were destined. The day of the elders' meeting arrived, and tension hung thick in the air at Harmony Chapel. Miriam sat in the parsonage, staring out the window as Elijah paced the room. He looked every bit the resolute pastor, his suit pressed, his Bible tucked under his arm, but Miriam could see the cracks in his armor. Elijah, she said softly, breaking the silence. Do you think they'll forgive us? Forgive me. He stopped pacing and turned to her, his face etched with worry. Forgiveness is God's domain, Miriam. But people can be unpredictable. We'll face this together, no matter what. Miriam nodded, her hands trembling in her lap. "I'm ready," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she truly believed it. The meeting was held in the church's fellowship hall. The elders sat in a semicircle, their faces a mix of concern and curiosity. Sister Beatrice, though not officially invited, had found a seat near the back, her presence unmistakable. Elijah stood at the front of the room with Miriam by his side. He cleared his throat, his voice steady despite the tension. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice. Miriam and I have something we need to share with you, something that affects not just our family but the church as a whole." The room was silent, save for the occasional creak of a chair. Elijah took a deep breath and continued. "Over the past few weeks, rumors have spread about Miriam and Brother Nathaniel. I won't waste time denying them. Some of what you've heard is true." A murmur rippled through the room. Sister Beatrice leaned forward, her lips pressed into a thin line. Elijah raised a hand to quiet the group. "But I want to be clear, Miriam has taken full responsibility for her actions, and we are committed to rebuilding our marriage. This has been a painful time for us, but it's also been a time of reflection and repentance. We ask for your prayers and your understanding as we move forward." Miriam stepped forward, her voice shaking as she spoke. "I know I've let you all down. I've let my family down. I can't take back what I've done, but I can promise to do everything in my power to make things right. I'm stepping down from the worship team and focusing on my family. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me." For a moment, there was silence. Then, Deacon Harold stood. "Pastor, Sister Miriam, we appreciate your honesty. But the church has been hurt by this. Trust has been broken, and that won't be easy to repair." Another elder, Sister Louise, nodded. "We'll need to pray on this. The congregation will need to be addressed as well. If we keep this within the elders, it could lead to even more division." Elijah's jaw tightened. He had hoped to contain the fallout, but he knew they were right. "We'll address the congregation at Sunday service," he said. "I'll take full responsibility as the leader of this church." As the meeting dispersed, Sister Beatrice lingered, her eyes narrowing as she approached Harold and Louise. "You're really going to let this slide?" she hissed. Louise frowned. "Beatrice, no one is letting anything slide. But casting stones isn't the answer either." Beatrice crossed her arms. "If the pastor can't lead his own household, how can he lead this church? The congregation deserves better." Harold sighed. "Beatrice, we've heard your concerns. Let's pray for wisdom before jumping to conclusions." But Beatrice wasn't satisfied. As she left the meeting, she began devising a plan to rally more members of the congregation to her cause. That Sunday, the sanctuary was packed. Word had spread that the pastor would be addressing the rumors, and everyone wanted to hear it firsthand. Elijah stood at the pulpit, his hands gripping the edges as he scanned the expectant faces before him. "My brothers and sisters," he began, his voice strong but tinged with emotion, "today I stand before you not as a perfect man, but as a flawed servant of God. Over the past weeks, my family has faced a trial that has shaken us to our core. Some of you may have heard rumors about my wife and Brother Nathaniel. I won't deny them, but I will say this, our God is a God of forgiveness and redemption." The congregation murmured, their reactions a mix of shock and understanding. "I ask for your prayers," Elijah continued. "Not just for Miriam and me, but for this church. Let this be a time of healing, not division. And for those who feel they cannot stay under my leadership, I understand. I only ask that you seek God's guidance in whatever decision you make." Miriam sat in the front pew, tears streaming down her face as Elijah spoke. She felt the weight of her actions more acutely than ever. As the service ended, Sister Beatrice stood abruptly, addressing the crowd. "Pastor, with all due respect, how can we trust leadership that allows such a betrayal to happen? This church deserves better. Gasps echoed through the sanctuary, and Elijah's face hardened. Sister Beatrice, he said firmly, if you have concerns, I ask that you bring them to the elders. This is not the time or place. But Beatrice wasn't backing down. This is exactly the time and place, Pastor. The people deserve to know where their leadership stands. The congregation erupted into whispers, the tension in the room palpable. Meanwhile, miles away, Nathaniel sat in a quiet diner, staring at the unsigned letter from Miriam. His phone buzzed on the table, a message from an unknown number. Nathaniel, it's Miriam. I need to hear your voice. Please, just one call. He stared at the message, torn between the past and the path he knew he should take. The congregation remained frozen, the sanctuary heavy with tension after Sister Beatrice's outburst. Elijah took a deep breath, his jaw tightening as he prepared to address her directly. But before he could speak, Deacon Harold stepped forward. Sister Beatrice, Harold said, his voice firm but calm, this church has always been a place of grace and healing. Pastor Elijah has owned his part in this situation, and so has Sister Miriam. None of us are without sin, and it is not our place to stand in judgment. Beatrice narrowed her eyes, her lips pressed into a thin line. It's not judgment, Deacon. It's accountability. This church deserves leadership that sets an example of integrity, not one mired in scandal. The congregation murmured, divided between those nodding in agreement and others who looked uncomfortable with Beatrice's sharp words. Elijah held up his hand, calling for silence. I understand your concerns, Sister Beatrice, he said, his voice steady. But let me remind you that the foundation of our faith is forgiveness. Miriam and I are committed to rebuilding not only our marriage but the trust of this congregation. If there are those who feel they cannot follow my leadership, I respect your decision. But this is my home, and I will not abandon it in its time of need. A ripple of applause broke out, scattered but supportive. Beatrice glared at Elijah but said nothing more, retreating to her seat with a huff. Later that evening, Elijah and Miriam sat together in their living room, the weight of the day pressing down on them. Miriam's hands trembled as she poured herself a glass of water. She won't stop, Miriam said, her voice barely above a whisper. Beatrice. She's going to keep stirring the pot until she gets what she wants. Elijah sighed, rubbing his temples. Let her. If people want to leave, they'll leave. We can't control that. All we can do is stay true to our commitment to each other and to this church. Miriam nodded, though her heart felt heavy. I just hope it's enough. Miles away, Nathaniel sat in his hotel room, staring at the message from Miriam on his phone. He knew responding would be a mistake, but the longing in her words tugged at him. Against his better judgment, he picked up his phone and dialed her number. She answered on the first ring. Nathaniel, she breathed, her voice thick with emotion. Miriam, he replied, his tone cautious. I got your message. What's going on? I don't know, she admitted. Everything feels so overwhelming. Elijah's trying, but it's like there's this wall between us. And all I can think about is you. Nathaniel closed his eyes, torn between his feelings for her and the knowledge that staying in contact would only make things worse. Miriam, you have to focus on your marriage. I care about you, but we both know this, whatever we had, it has to end. Her voice cracked as she spoke. I know you're right. I needed to hear your voice one last time. There was a long pause before Nathaniel finally said, take care of yourself, Miriam. And with that, he ended the call, his chest aching with a sense of finality. Back in Harmony Chapel, Sister Beatrice wasn't finished. She began hosting informal prayer meetings in her home, inviting those she knew were dissatisfied with Elijah's leadership. What started as quiet discussions of church matters soon turned into outright criticism of the pastor and his wife. "We can't let this go on," Beatrice said one evening, her voice filled with conviction. "The longer they stay, the more damage they'll do to this church." One of the attendees, a young mother named Rachel, hesitated. "But Sister Beatrice, don't we believe in forgiveness? Isn't that what Pastor Elijah was talking about on Sunday?" Beatrice scoffed. "Forgiveness doesn't mean we turn a blind eye to sin, Rachel. If we allow this to continue, what kind of message are we sending to our children? That it's okay to betray your vows as long as you apologize afterward." The group murmured in agreement, and Beatrice knew she had them. As weeks passed, the congregation became increasingly divided. Attendance at services began to dwindle, and the atmosphere in the sanctuary grew tense. Elijah did his best to address the growing unrest, but the weight of it all was beginning to take its toll. One Sunday, as Elijah prepared to deliver his sermon, he noticed a smaller than usual crowd. Beatrice sat near the back, flanked by a group of her supporters, their expressions cold and distant. Miriam, seated in the front row, looked up at Elijah with a mixture of hope and fear. She could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the strain of trying to hold everything together. As Elijah stepped up to the pulpit, he hesitated for a moment, then spoke from his heart. "This church is at a crossroads," he began. "I won't pretend that the events of the past weeks haven't shaken us. But I believe that God can use even our brokenness to bring about healing and restoration. The question is, are we willing to let Him?" The congregation listened in silence, some moved by his sincerity, others unmoved. Beatrice, however, was already planning her next move. Months passed, and the turmoil at Harmony Chapel began to ease, though not without scars. Elijah and Miriam attended counseling together, both for their marriage and individually. Through those difficult sessions, they confronted not only the affair but also the deeper issues that had led to their emotional distance. For Elijah, it was realizing how his devotion to the church had overshadowed his devotion to his wife. For Miriam, it was acknowledging her need for affirmation and the choices that had led her astray. Slowly but surely, they began to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. The turning point came during a church retreat, where Elijah gave a heartfelt testimony in front of a gathering of pastors and their spouses. He spoke openly about his struggles as a husband and a leader, sharing how he had nearly lost everything but found redemption through God's grace. "I've learned," Elijah said, his voice steady, "that leadership doesn't mean perfection. It means humility. It means asking for help when you need it and relying on the one who never fails, even when we do." The vulnerability in his words resonated deeply with the audience, and for the first time in months, Elijah felt the weight of his guilt lift. Back at Harmony Chapel, Sister Beatrice's attempts to divide the congregation lost momentum. Many members grew weary of her relentless criticism, and some even began to distance themselves from her prayer meetings. One Sunday, Deacon Harold gently confronted her after service. "Beatrice," he said, his tone kind but firm, "you've done a lot for this church over the years, but sometimes holding on to bitterness does more harm than good. Maybe it's time to let go." Beatrice stiffened, but Harold's words stayed with her. Over the weeks that followed, she began to soften, attending services more quietly and refraining from stirring controversy. Meanwhile, Nathaniel had settled in a new city, working with a different church and using his experiences as a cautionary tale in his ministry. He often thought of Miriam but chose to keep his distance, knowing that her path was no longer tied to his. One evening, as he finished a performance at a small church revival, he received a text from an unknown number. "Thank you for letting me go. I hope you're doing well. Miriam." Nathaniel smiled sadly, replying simply, "I am. Wishing you peace and happiness." It was the closure he didn't know he needed. On a warm Sunday morning, Harmony Chapel felt alive again. The sanctuary was filled with laughter, music, and the hum of a congregation ready to move forward. Miriam stood beside Elijah, singing a hymn with the choir, a hymn about grace and new beginnings. Her voice was strong, her heart lighter than it had been in months. As Elijah stepped up to the pulpit, he glanced at his wife, their eyes meeting in a brief moment of shared understanding. He turned to the congregation and smiled. "Today, I want to talk about restoration," he began. "Not just in our personal lives, but in our community. We've been through a storm, but God's light has always been with us, guiding us back to Him." The congregation erupted into applause, the energy in the room a testament to the resilience of faith, love, and forgiveness. In the weeks that followed, attendance grew, new families joined the church, and even Sister Beatrice seemed more at peace, volunteering for outreach programs instead of focusing on gossip. Harmony Chapel had weathered the storm, and in its wake, it found something stronger, a deeper sense of community and an unwavering belief in the power of grace. And as Elijah and Miriam walked hand in hand out of the sanctuary that day, they both knew they had been given a second chance, not just as husband and wife, but as partners in a shared journey of faith and